let's get started. Welcome back, everyone. We're so excited to have you back in our next to last learning session, session 5. Welcome back after a week of vacation. We know it's hard to come back and get into the groove after you've been away for a week. We are hoping that you used your week to catch up on your adaptation workbook, and if not, please reach out to Patricia and Courtney and I if you need additional coaching and assistance, or if you have some questions. We're happy to get you back up to speed so that you can finish the course. This week, we will be talking about the last step of the adaptation workbook, step 5. And this step focuses on monitoring and evaluating the effectiveness of your adaptation actions. I think all of you are unmuted, but just in case, let's check that. And please feel free to rename yourself so we know who is in the room. This week, Patricia and I will be walking you through step 5, and Courtney is on the line as well. Today's agenda, we're going to do a brief recap of where we have been throughout these weeks and introduce step 5. We will actually do a recap of step 4 in our discussion session following this short lecture. After I introduce step 5, I'll hand it off to Patricia, who will be working us through some quick tips on how to use the adaptation workbook in this section and how to actually export your adaptation workbook, because you can do that at any time. And as soon as you're done with step 5, you'll be done. So it'll be good to learn how to do that this week. Okay, so let's review where we are this week. In our first week, we defined goals and objectives and really started to sketch out what our projects are, what they look like, where they're located, what those goals and objectives are. Then you assessed your climate change vulnerabilities in the second week and used vulnerability assessments and other literature to help, really elaborate on how your specific area might be vulnerable to different climate change impacts based on where you're located and what that landform looks like. The following week after that, you evaluated how climate change might affect what you want to do on the land. How does climate change affect your goals and your objectives? And the week before last, probably everyone's favorite part was getting down to brass tacks and developing those adaptation tactics that help you address your challenges and opportunities and can really, eventually help you capitalize on those opportunities as well. This week, you'll brainstorm different ways to monitor and evaluate the effectiveness of those adaptation actions to ensure that we're keeping track of what we're doing on the landscape and ensuring that we are, actually meeting our goals and our objectives down the line. Like I mentioned, after you complete the adaptation workbook, you can go through and export your workbook to a PDF or a Word document, and Patricia will help walk us through that tutorial at the end of the class. So really briefly, when we think about monitoring, we're probably all coming from different points on the spectrum. When you hear the word monitoring, what first comes to mind for you? Well, for many of us, maybe actually something very different. So we wanted to walk through different ways that we can monitor our actions and outline, what it is that we would be really focusing on if we were to take any of these different tracks. So when we think about monitoring, it's really about asking the right question that will help us detect our desired conditions over time. And there's several different types of monitoring that you might encounter in science and in management. For example, the first type of monitoring that I think many of us coming from more of that science perspective might think of is using monitoring as a scientific tool, as a point of research. And when we use it in this manner, we're really trying to establish an answer to a question or a hypothesis that we have, and using monitoring to help judge the quality of replication and maybe even deviation through time. So we'll be, if we're thinking about monitoring as a scientific tool, we're thinking about long-term monitoring and looking at trends and using that data to help answer a question. For most of you in this class, and really most of us in the real world, this is probably a type of monitoring that we would find onerous and kind of difficult, and maybe difficult to sustain in the long, in the long term, because if we take this tract, we're really trying to detect a statistical change. So really, we don't often use this type of monitoring in adaptation planning. Another type of monitoring is impact or response monitoring. And we would use this type of monitoring to describe change over time. But this type of monitoring doesn't rigorously support cause and effect. It consists of repeated measurements done to a specific standard. So for example, we use forest inventory and stocking surveys to measure growth, canopy cover, ground cover, or survival of planted seedlings as a way of, just monitoring occurrence. Phenology monitoring is another example where you might record the dates of leaf out or bird arrival every spring. And this type of monitoring usually attempts to answer a particular question that is relevant to your management goals. But this type of monitoring can be expensive and time consuming as well. So wherever possible, it's good to piggyback on partnerships or collaborations that are happening in the region that you can use that monitoring data and include it into your existing inventories or surveying. Next, there's implementation monitoring, and this can be useful if we're implementing an action because of climate change, and we want to monitor the execution of that change. That is often a yes or no type of observation, like maybe we have a culvert, we know it's drastically undersized, and so we're going to put in a bridge that can cope with much higher stream flows. After a major flooding event, we could go and say, did this implemented action do what we wanted it to do? Yes. We implemented a bridge. Yes. Did that bridge help us achieve, coping with that climate extreme? Yes. Another type of monitoring is effectiveness monitoring. So if you define the desired effect, did it work? I guess my example is probably more of an effectiveness monitoring, a little of both. Anyways, so for example, if you install berms to slow the overland flow of water, after some time has that water slowed? Does the downhill system become less inundated? This type of monitoring is usually carefully designed based on a conceptual model of the system and supports cause and effect over a meaningful time period. And this type of monitoring can work really well for adaptation, where your actions effective in meeting your goals and your objectives in the end. So the main task this week in step 5 is to consider all of those different monitoring options and the efforts that are available to you through different partnerships and collaborations, and think about those as ways that you can integrate into your adaptation plan. You can also consider, what new monitoring items may be required to evaluate whether you can meet your management goals down the line. So breaking this step up and working through some of the pieces that you'll be thinking about. In this step, you'll first define your monitoring variable. Identify monitoring items that will be useful can help us evaluate whether we've achieved our management objectives and goals, or whether we've achieved a milestone that indicates progress towards that goal. When possible, we'll select monitoring items that will also help us understand whether the adaptation tactics recommended in the previous step were effective in working towards our management goals under climate change. So for example, if your tactic is to underplant with future adapted tree species that are suitable for your system, you may choose to monitor the survival rate of those particular seedlings. This may be different from your standard survey in that you're monitoring at a higher density and probably more frequently than you would usually. And we're really honing in here when we think about adaptation monitoring variable, inserting this idea of planted seedling survival. In the next step, we identify a value or a threshold that's meaningful for this monitoring item. So we would think about the units that you're using to measure your metric and really thinking about that target number. So based on the last example, what number of surviving seedlings would represent success? In this example, we've chosen 60% survival as the criteria that we will use for evaluation. So the monitoring would take place, would really focus on those planted seedlings, and we would measure success of that action if the survival of those seedlings was greater than 60%. So trying to tie it all together here. And lastly, we'll just explain, how we will gather this information. So for example, you may monitor seedling survival every summer for 5 years after planting, or because maybe you're introducing a new species, maybe you increase that frequency to something like monitoring every year. And remember, it can save you time and money if you take advantage of existing monitoring surveys or inventories. So think about groups that are working in your region that are already doing some type of monitoring. Maybe you have a partnership with a university that is doing some type of experiment that you can work with them to access that data as well. Take advantage of anything that's going on locally that will benefit, your bottom line in the end, so that you're not doing all this monitoring on your own is always the best way. Some existing networks that can help you find some weather data like CocoRa's Rain, Snow, and Hail Network. The National Phenology Network is a really cool online environment where you can check out citizens who are writing down, leaf out dates for different species and recording that information and displaying it online. You can use that data, add it to your own, download the regional data. There's several, I'm sure, different partnerships that can relieve some of the burden of implementation. So if there's any that you can think of right now that you think might be useful to other folks in this class, please add it to the chat box. I think that would be really helpful for folks. Okay, so I was trying to string together all of the ideas as I was working through this, the different pieces of step 5. But what we've done right here is we've sort of put them all up on the screen and then into this rubric. And you can see that probably something in that left-hand column speaks to you or to your project. And so you can see yourself in one of those zones. And so let's say invasive species control, the top line, being one of the monitoring variables that you would choose or want to study. Well, the next idea would be, what is that criteria for evaluation? What would be success? And so they're saying in this example that areas identified for invasive species control, they want to have less than 20% of that invasive species cover at the end. That's part of, ties into their adaptation tactics. Their monitoring implementation will be to do an annual species survey. So they have a monitoring adaptation they have an adaptation tactic they defined in step 4, and in step 5 is sort of the follow-up. How do we know that our actions were effective? So let's look at another example, regeneration success. Well, the criteria for evaluation will be if more than 50% of the desired species is in a certain age class of growth, 0.5 to 2 inch age class or size class. How we would monitor that is doing some sort of survey, visual survey, regeneration survey every 2 to 4 years after harvest. So you can sort of get the flow of this. Really what we're trying to do is just create some documentation that really helps to explain the effectiveness of the actions that we've specified in step 4. And the outcome of all of this is really to define realistic and feasible monitoring items, create a monitoring plan that can be used to help determine whether our management should be altered in the future, and create some documentation to account for new information and observations. Keep in mind that the projects you're working on are likely going to be handed to somebody else down the line, and so they're going to want to be able to keep track of when you did what you did and keep track of some sort of observational history thereafter. Okay, so you've all seen this graphic before. This is something that sort of ties together all of the different steps from the adaptation workbook. And the idea here is that, there's an intentionality to each of these steps in helping us create this overall climate-informed management plan. And monitoring really helps to connect all of those dots together. As we finish our monitoring plans, our metrics are directly linked to measure the effectiveness of our adaptation tactics, which describe how we will implement our strategies and our overall concepts of resistance, resilience, and transition. We can trace these to the management challenges and opportunities and the direct impacts on our systems that we define in step 2, for which, we've identified our goals and our objectives. So monitoring helps us know whether we're on track to meet those management goals and objectives in the end. So with that, we hope you're ready to tackle the last step of the adaptation workbook. And we really like this step because we find that brainstorming is a really fun activity, and hopefully you might find new ways to tap into existing monitoring efforts and maybe create some new partnerships as well. So I will pass it on to Patricia, who will lead us into pro tips. But before I do that, does anyone have any questions that they want to ask at this time? I see that Andrew Bishop put in some great ideas into the chat box. eBird and iNaturalist as good tools for citizen science. If anyone else has any other ideas, feel free to share.
All right, thank you, Danielle. Danielle is going to advance my slides today, and I'm going to leave my video off just to save on bandwidth. It's raining here, so I have a good feeling it wouldn't work if I tried it. So good morning, everybody. I'll be covering some of the more technical aspects of the adaptation workbook, including how to add your monitoring variables and apply it to specific objectives. I'll give you a reminder to finish the step 5 homework. And finally, I'll show you some tips and tricks to export and edit a copy of the finished workbook. Please remember that there are also tips in the tutorial PDF and the videos that are embedded in each step of the workbook. So please check those out if you want to dive a little deeper. Next slide. To add a monitoring variable, then just go to step 5 in the online workbook. Remember, if you need to review the instructions or additional resources like those videos, just click on the carrots at the top of the page, those little upside down triangle type symbols, and that information will slide down and appear. When you're ready to enter information, click on the box with the orange lettering, which says add a monitoring variable. The box that pops up will also prompt you to enter your criteria for evaluation and also how you implement the monitoring. So click save when you're done, and next slide, thanks. And then next, the workbook asks you to review your objectives from step 1. They'll just magically appear for you, and all you have to do is click yes for any objective where this monitoring variable would apply. A monitoring variable might be helpful for one or many of your management objectives, so you can choose as many as is necessary. And of course, if it doesn't apply, just click no and move on. At this point, then you can either add another monitoring variable, and that button is in orange, or you can click next to continue. Next slide. And then the final task for this week is to complete the step 5 homework, which asks you to think about the key questions you're trying to answer with your monitoring metrics and whether you already have the information that can help you. So this really just summarizes how you're feeling about the work that you just did in step 5. Next slide. And then congratulations, you have completed all steps of the adaptation workbook process, 1 through 5. Now, I bet you're wondering how to download this information for your coworkers or your stakeholders or simply for posterity. So after you've completed step 5, in your navigation window on the left-hand side, under step 5, you'll see an option to export and share your plan. So click on that, and next slide. Then a dialog window will inform you that the plan has been formatted in landscape mode. So click OK. Next slide. And then the next window will give you some options while saving as a PDF. But all you really have to do here is click save, and that PDF will be generated for you. Now, here's the real pro tip. If you want a different format, or if you just want an editable version, open that saved PDF in Adobe Acrobat and then click Save As and choose a Word format. And then you can format that in landscape or portrait or whatever works for you. And now you can really customize it in that Word document. If you don't have the pro version of Adobe Acrobat, just email us your PDF and we can send you back a Word version that you'll be able to manipulate however you want it. So just let us know what you need and how you need it, and we'll be happy to help you out with that. Next slide. All right, so before next Monday, go ahead and complete step 5, and note that it may take 2 to 3 hours roughly to complete this step. So be sure to give yourself the time you need. Complete the homework and the adaptation workbook after you complete step 5. That's not a heavy lift, maybe 10 or 15 minutes. And we've also provided some additional reading for this week, which describes a really neat methodology to use forest inventory and the climate change tree atlas model results to assess the risk of a particular forest stand to climate change. So if you have good inventory records, this paper is a really good read and was authored by Maria Genoviak and others. And Maria is often a co-instructor of this course and a coordinator for the New England Climate Change Response Framework Project. So very good read. Next slide. All right, looking ahead, next week we'll have our regularly scheduled meeting on Tuesday the 27th. Danielle and Courtney will be presenting on communicating climate change, which is a really important part of getting from ideas to acceptance and then finally to implementation. And then the discussion session will ask you to share the monitoring ideas that you came up this week. So please be prepared to share your thoughts, impressions, barriers, whatever you come up with. So that concludes the lecture portion of our time today, but stick around for the discussion session, which will begin in just a minute. But first, are there any questions?